All right, guys, so we're starting a new book, John Steinbeck, East of Eden, Chapter 1. The Salinas Valley is in Northern California. It is a long, narrow swale between two ranges of mountains, and the Salinas River winds and twists up the center until it falls at last into Monterey Bay. I remember my childhood names for grasses and secret flowers. I remember where a toad may live and what time the birds awaken in the summer, and what trees and seasons smell like, how people looked and walked and smelled even. The memory of odors is very rich. I remember that the Gabilan Mountains to the east of the valley were light gay mountains full of sun and loveliness and a kind of invitation so that you wanted to climb into their warm foothills almost as you want to climb into the lap of a beloved mother. They were beckoning mountains with a brown grass love. The Santa Lucias stood up against the sky to the west and kept the valley from the open sea, and they were dark and brooding, unfriendly and dangerous. I always found in myself a dread of west and a love of east. Wherever I got such an idea I cannot say, unless it could be that the morning came over the peaks of the Gabalans and the night drifted back from the ridges of Santa Lucias. It may be that the birth and death of the day had some part in my feeling about the two ranges of mountains. From both sides of the valley little streams slipped out of the hill canyons and fell into the bed of the Salinas River. In the winter of wet years the streams ran full freshet, and they swelled the river until sometimes it raged and boiled, bank full, and then it was a destroyer. The river tore the edges of the farmlands and washed whole acres down. It toppled barns and houses into itself to go floating and bobbing away. It trapped cows and pigs and sheep and drowned them in its muddy brown water and carried them to the sea. Then when the late spring came, the river drew in from its edges and the sandbanks appeared. And in the summer the river didn't run at all above ground. Some pools would be left in the deep swirl places under a high bank. The tules and grasses grew back, and willows straightened up with the flood debris in their upper branches. The Salinas was only a part-time river. The summer sun drove it underground. It was not a fine river at all, but it was the only one we had, and so we boasted about it, how dangerous it was in a wet winter, and how dry it was in a dry summer. You can boast about anything if it's all you have. Maybe the less you have, the more you are required to boast. The floor of the Salinas Valley between the ranges and below the foothills is level because this valley used to be the bottom of a 100-mile inlet from the sea. The river mouth at Moss Landing was centuries ago the entrance to this long inland water. Once, 50 miles down the valley, my father bored a well. The drill came up first with topsoil, and then with gravel, and then with white sea sand full of shells, and even pieces of whalebone. There were 20 feet of sand, and then black earth again, and even a piece of red wood, that imperishable wood that does not rot. Before the inland sea, the valley must have been a forest, and those things had happened right under our feet. And it seemed to me sometimes at night that I could feel both the sea and the redwood forest before it. On the wide level acres of the valley, the topsoil lay deep and fertile. It required only a rich winter of rain to make it break forth in grass and flowers. The spring flowers in a wet year were unbelievable. The whole valley floor and the foothills, too, would be carpeted with lupins and poppies. Once a woman told me that colored flowers would seem more bright if you added a few white flowers to give the colors definition. Every petal of blue lupin is edged with white, so that a field of lupins is more blue than you can imagine. And mixed with these were splashes of California poppies. These too are of a burning color, not orange, not gold, but if pure gold were liquid and could raise a cream, that golden cream might be like the color of the poppies. When their season was over, the yellow mustard came up and grew to a great height. When my grandfather came into the valley, the mustard was so tall that a man on horseback showed only his head above the yellow flowers. On the uplands, the grass would be strewn with buttercups, with hen and chickens, with black-centered yellow violets. And a little later in the season, there would be red and yellow stands of Indian paintbrush. These were the flowers of the open places exposed to the sun. Under the live oaks, shaded and dusky, the maidenhair flourished and gave a good smell. and under the mossy banks of the water courses whole clumps of five-fingered ferns and goldie backs hung down. Then there were harebells, tiny lanterns, cream white and almost sinful looking, and these were so rare and magical that a child finding one felt singled out and special all day long. Be red and yellow stands of Indian paintbrush? I'll look that up. When June came, the grasses headed out and turned brown, and the hills turned a brown which was not brown but a gold and saffron and red, an indescribable color. And from then on until the next rains, the earth dried and the streams popped. Cracks appeared on the level ground. The Salinas River sank under its sand. The wind blew down the valley, picking up dust and straws, and grew stronger and harsher as it went south. It stopped in the evening. It was a rasping, nervous wind, and the dust particles cut into a man's skin and burned his eyes. Men working in the fields wore goggles and tied handkerchiefs around their noses to keep the dirt out. The valley land was deep and rich, but the foothills wore only a skin of topsoil no deeper than the grass roots, and the farther up the hills you went, the thinner grew the soil, with flints sticking through, until at the brush line it was a kind of dry flinty gravel that reflected the hot sun blindly. I have spoken of the rich years when the rainfall was plentiful, but there were dry years too, and they put a terror on the valley. But the water came in a 30-year cycle. There would be 5 or 6 wet and wonderful years when there might be 19 to 25 inches of rain, and the land would shout with grass. Then would come 6 or 7 pretty good years of 12 to 16 inches of rain, and then the dry years would come, and sometimes there would be only 7 or 8 inches of rain. The land dried up, and the grasses headed out miserably a few inches high, and great bare scabby places appeared in the valley. The live oaks got a crusty look, and the sagebrush was gray. The land cracked, and the springs dried up, and the cattle listlessly nibbed dry twigs. The land cracked, and the springs dried up, and the cattle listlessly nibbled dry twigs. Then the farmers and the ranchers would be filled with disgust for the Salinas Valley. The cows would grow thin and sometimes starve to death. People would have to haul water in barrels to their farms just for drinking. Some families would sell out for nearly nothing and move away. So the cows would grow thin and sometimes starve to death. People would have to haul water in barrels to their farms just to drink. Some families would sell out for nearly nothing and move away. And it never failed that during the dry years, the people forgot about the rich years. And during the wet years, they lost all memory of the dry years. It was always that way. And that was along Salinas Valley. Its history was like that of the rest of the state. First there were Indians, an inferior breed without energy, inventiveness, or culture, a people that lived on grubs and grasshoppers and shellfish, too lazy to hunt or fish. They ate what they could pick up and planted nothing. They pounded bitter acorns for flour. Even their warfare was a weary pantomime. Then the hard, dry Spaniards came exploring through, greedy and realistic, and their greed was for gold or God. They collected souls as they collected jewels. They gathered mountains and valleys, rivers and whole horizons, the way a man might now gain title to building lots. These tough, dried-up men moved restlessly up the coast and down. Some of them stayed on grants as large as principalities given to them by Spanish kings, who had not the faintest idea of the gift. These first owners lived in poor feudal settlements, and their cattle ranged freely and multiplied. Periodically, the owners killed the cattle for their hides and tallow, and left the meat to the vultures and coyotes. When the Spaniards came, they had to give everything they saw a name. This is the first duty of an explorer, a duty and a privilege. You must name a thing before you can note it on your hand-drawn map. Of course, they were religious people, and the men who could read and write, who kept the records and drew the maps, were the tough, untiring priests who traveled with the soldiers. Thus the first names of places were saints' names and religious holidays celebrated at stopping places. There are many saints, but they are not inexhaustible, so that we find repetitions in the first namings. We have San Miguel, Saint Michael, San Ardo, San Bernardo, San Benito, San Lorenzo, San Carlos, San Francisquito, and then the holidays, Natividad, the Nativity, Nacimiento, the birth, Soledad, the solitude, but places were also named from the way the expedition felt at the time. Buena Esperanza, Good Hope, Buena Vista, because the view was beautiful, and Chualar, because it was pretty. The descriptive names followed: Paso de los Robles, because of the oak trees, Los Laureles, for the laurels, Tularcitos, because of the reeds in the swamp, and Salinas, for the alcali, which was white as salt. The places were named for animals and birds seen: Gavilanes, for the hawks which flew in those mountains, Topo, for the mole, Los Gatos, for the wild cats. The suggestion sometimes came from the nature of the place itself: Tasahara, a cup of saucer; Laguna Seca, a dry lake; Corral de Tierra, for a fence of earth; Paraíso, because it was like heaven. Excuse me. Then the Americans came, more greedy because there were more of them. They took the lands, remade the laws to make their titles good, and farmholds spread over the land, first in the valleys and then up the foothill slopes, small wooden houses roofed with redwood shakes, corals of split poles. Wherever a trickle of water came out of the ground, a house sprang up and a family began to grow and multiply. Wherever a trickle of water came out of the ground, a house sprang up and a family began to grow and multiply. It's funny. I love the description. So then the Americans came, more greedy because there were more of them. They took the lands, remade the laws to make their titles good, and farmholds spread over the land, first in the valleys and then up the foothill slopes, small wooden houses roofed with redwood shakes, corals of split poles. Whenever a trickle of water came out of the ground, a house sprang up and a family began to grow and multiply. Cuttings of red geraniums and rose bushes were planted in the dooryards. Wheel tracks of buckboards replaced the trails. Wheel tracks of buckboards replaced the trails, and fields of corn and barley and wheat squared out of the yellow mustard. Every 10 miles along the traveled routes, a general store and blacksmith shop happened, and these became the nuclei of little towns: Bradley, King City, Greenfield. The Americans had a greater tendency to name places for people than had the Spanish. After the valleys were settled, the names of places refer more to things which happened there, and these to me are the most fascinating of all names because each name suggests a story that has been forgotten. I think of Bolsa Nueva, a new purse; Morocojo, a lame Moor. A lame Moor. Who was he and how did he get there? Wild Horse Canyon and Mustang Grade and Shirt Tail Canyon. The names of places carry a charge of the people who named them: reverent or irreverent, descriptive, either poetic or disparaging. You can name anything San Lorenzo, but Shirt Tail Canyon or the Lame Moor is something quite different. The wind whistled over the settlements in the afternoon, and the farmers began to set out mile-long windbreaks of eucalyptus to keep the plowed topsoil from blowing away. And this is about the way the Salinas Valley was when my grandfather brought his wife and settled in the foothills to the east of King City. So the wind whistled over the settlements in the afternoon, and the farmers began to set out mile-long windbreaks of eucalyptus to keep the plowed topsoil from blowing away. So they put something in front of the wind was coming in our direction, so they put, a little barrier of eucalyptus so the wind could go over the seeds that they had planted. And this was about the way the Salinas Valley was when my grandfather brought his wife and settled in the foothills to the east of King City.